My name's Eric Alexander. I'm the executive director of the Brigham Education Institute. I know many of you. I don't know all of you, but welcome and thank you for joining us. And a big thank you to our three guests here today. Christina, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. I am super excited today. We have three fantastic guest speakers. And, the one thing that I do sort of want to point out is that each and every one of these persons, editors that are speaking today, really has a passion for peer review and a passion for educational scholarship. So it really is an honor for all of us to learn from them today. So first up is Dr. Doug Smith, Smink. He is actually the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Surgical Education. He is an associate professor of surgery at HMS and chief of surgery at Brigham and Women's Faulkner Hospital. His research focuses on resident and faculty education through simulation, team training, and coaching. We also are joined by Dr. Lauren Maggio, who is the deputy editor of Perspectives on Medical Education. She is a professor of medicine and health professions education at the Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences, and her research focuses on understanding the creation, dissemination, and utilization of health information on patient care and health professions education. We're also joined by Dr. Grace Huang, who is editor-in-chief of MedEd Portal. She is associate professor of medicine and dean for faculty affairs at Harvard Medical School and a hospitalist at the Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center. She leads the Rabkin Fellowship in Medical Education, and she co-directs the BIDMC Academy. And her research focuses on procedural training for internal medicine residents, critical thinking, high-value care, and more recently, educational scholarship itself. Now, as we move forward in this session, Doug will offer some insights on why you should peer review. Lauren will offer some insights on what you can avoid in peer review, and Grace will offer some insights on peer review as professional development. And what I would like to say here, this is a three-part series, and we have recordings of the first two sessions in the series. We were joined by Deb Simpson. We were joined by Shubha Ramani. We got a sense of what peer review really is in terms of the background, how a journal article moves through that process. And then we actually, in our last session, did a peer review together. And so these recordings are actually, if you're interested, a way of having a deeper foundation of peer review. And so I hope some of you will visit those videos, and Caitlin's popping in the chat box now. But what I really wanted to do with this whole series, my vision, was to open up this black box of peer review, because I have spoken with so many individuals who say, I couldn't possibly. I don't have the expertise. I'm not qualified enough. I don't know how to do it. I don't feel competent. And my answer to those conversations was this series. And so today we just want to keep opening that black box for you and give you a sense of how these fantastic editors think about peer review. And so what I'd like to do now is actually get everybody going with the chat box. So go ahead and find your chat box, type in a message. What is one question that you would like answered by the end of this session? Absolutely, Martin, imposter phenomenon is real, and I see it often when working with trainees in peer review. Thank you, Nora, agree. So go ahead and pop in one question that you would like answered by the end of this session today. Everyone go ahead and take a moment and do that now, please. Fantastic. Thank you, Chris. Team review, mentored review. How does Dr. Huang do it all? How do I avoid bias if I'm asked to peer review? Great questions. Martin, I don't. Facilitating a faster process. How do editors recommend incorporating residents in peer review, national standards? I think all of these are fantastic questions. I thank you for popping them in the chat. What we're going to try to do throughout the process of this hour together is make sure that we get most, if not all of these answered at some point through the conversation. So thank you for popping them in there so that we have them. What I would like to go ahead and do now is invite Dr. Doug Smink to talk for a few minutes about the process of reviewing. Doug.
Great. Hello, everybody. Thanks, Christina, for inviting me to be part of this panel. I'm excited to be part of it, and I'm eager to hear what Grace and Lauren have to say after me. I get to sort of set the stage about peer review, and I will say that I sometimes get asked to give talks about being an editor, and I always have a bit of a diversion about the peer review process. So I love that we're spending a whole session about it, because it is really important to do. It is part of our academic citizenship, and I feel very strongly that it is a responsibility for anybody who submits papers because your papers benefit from peer review, to also be a peer reviewer and give that benefit back to other people. And I'll try to address some of those questions that came up in my talk or as we go through the questions later. The thing I always start with by saying about peer reviewing is that you should do it. When given the chance, you should do it. Now that sounds simple, and we'll talk about how you can get yourself to be a peer reviewer. But to give you the perspective as a journal editor, journals are dying for reviewers. We always want more reviewers. And every time I talk about my journal, I always invite people to just email me. If you want to be a reviewer, just email me. And the reason is because we only have so many people in our cadre of reviewers that we have in our websites. And I can say personally, I feel bad asking many people to review multiple times because I know how busy everybody is. So if I could get an eager reviewer, I am always glad to add them to our list. Now, how do you get added? I think there are a couple of ways you can do that. One is by writing and getting your name out there. And writing papers, editors read those and they see who's writing about different topics, and then they might call on you. Sometimes reviewers are recommended by the author who may have referenced your paper. And then, I saw Emil Petrusa had a comment about getting trainees involved. And I do think as faculty, particularly senior faculty, we can really help the process and create more reviewers that will add to that cadre I was talking about. And I think it's important as senior faculty that we reach back to the reviewer, to the editor and say, could I mentor a trainee in this process? Could you ask them to review papers in the future, which is a great thing to do. But let's talk about reviewing a little bit more and why you should do it. I'll tell you, I actually think it makes you a better writer and a better researcher. As you review more and more papers in your field, you learn what people are writing about. And obviously, some papers are really cutting edge. So you get to see what's coming down the pike in your field. And you also get great examples of good and bad research and good and bad papers. And you'll see good and bad scientific writing, methodology, tables, discussions, all those things that actually, I think, if you put them in your toolkit, make you a better researcher. And then I find, particularly as you're starting the review process, what I always hear is, I don't know if I did a good review. How do I know if I did a good review? And it's hard. Some journals actually give you feedback with scoring of your reviews, but I would say most of the time editors are busy. And so we just take a good review and we move on, and we don't give great feedback. But one thing as a reviewer that you can really benefit is by seeing what other reviewers had to say about the same paper. So usually when you do a review, there might be 2 or 3 other reviewers, 1 or 2 maybe, depending on the journal. And then ultimately the editor sends an email to the author and usually copies the reviewers. And it will have everybody's review. So I often read not only my review, but what others said. And I try to learn and see, well, was I on target or not on target? What did the other people say? And sometimes you don't get that that email, but you may get a revision. And in the revision usually is a cover letter that lists all the reviews. So either way, I read those things because it helps me become a better reviewer and sort of gives me something to gauge myself against. I talked about the citizenship part, and I think this is really essential in academics. Peer review is a way to make papers better. It's also a way for journals to decide what papers should be published. And for anyone who's published a paper, I can tell you that other people spend hours reviewing your paper and making it better for no return. They don't have their name on it. They don't get paid to do it. And so you owe that back, I think, to the community. And then I always make this plea as a journal editor: when you are invited to review, please respond in a relatively timely fashion that you'll do it or not do it. And then please get it done on time, because I even saw something in there in the chat about the time of the process. And there are lots of things that can delay the process. But one is that sometimes reviews don't come back in 2 or 3 weeks like we asked them to. So the other thing I often am asked is, what is an editor looking for? And, it's particularly helpful if you're reviewing for a journal that you read or that presents the type of work that you do, because you'll have insight into what the editor of that journal is looking for, because you'll see what that journal usually publishes. But I think every journal is looking for good science. And by science, I mean generation of new knowledge with good, sound methodology and clear, well-written work. Because you know how challenging it can be to read a paper that's either not systematic, it's not clear, there isn't a clear hypothesis. And to read that in a journal, nobody's going to read it. And so we're looking for things that you would want to read in our journal. And we're looking for things that are novel and interesting. Now, not every paper is, a Nobel Prize, but it should have a different twist on a topic. It should be, sometimes it's a new topic, but often it's taking the field just a little bit further and building on what other people have written. So it should be interesting and it should be novel. And I do think when I look at an article and when I look at reviews, I have a sense of who I think my readers are. They're surgical educators. They happen to often be program directors of residency programs. And I think, is this what my readers are going to want to read? Because that's the most important thing. We want people to read our journals and read the articles that are in our journal. And the other question is, are other researchers going to want to cite this article? Because unfortunately, and I'll talk about this in a second, journals, like everything else in the world, we're measured in certain ways. And one is by how frequently our papers are cited. And so if I see a paper that I think other people are going to cite, and it's interesting, and it's good science, and it's well written, that makes it even more attractive to me to publish. So a few things that I've learned that I thought I would share. I think most interesting, I always thought of the editor of a journal when I was submitting to that journal as my opponent. And I want to dispel that rumor. I want you to think of the editor as your ally, because I can assure you, journal editors, although I used to think their job was to keep my paper out of their journal, we journal editors are looking for good papers. So if you have a good paper, a good manuscript, we want it we want to publish it as much as you want to get it published. And so I would encourage you to think that way, understand our frame of reference, and realize that we want your papers. We want your good papers. And I see a good paper that I think would have been good in my journal, published in another journal. And it's great for that author and that journal, but I lament that it wasn't published in my journal because I want to get the best papers in my journal. And so see the editor actually as an ally who's looking to publish your work, assuming it's good. And then the metrics that I talked about. So the most common one people talk about is the impact factor, which if you don't know, you can look up very easily online. It's a simple ratio. It's basically the number of papers that your journal published. That's on the denominator. And the numerator is the number of times those papers were referenced were cited in other papers. And so it's just a ratio. You may know that the New England Journal's impact factor, I think, is over 50. That means so with every time they publish an article, they're expecting it to be cited 50 times in the next 2 years. That's on average. And so that's part of the way they think. Is this paper going to be cited 50 times in 2 years? Because if it is, that's a bar that at least one of the qualifications for them to think about that article. There are alternative metrics, though, as the world has changed, and it's not just about references. There are they're called altmetric in some instances, but there are different ways that journals can be referred to and journal articles. So things like social media, Twitter and Facebook are very common. The print media are ways that those articles can be assessed and journals can be assessed based on that. But these are the types of things that we think about as journal editors as we are thinking about which articles to publish. This is my last slide, and it gets to that imposter syndrome. I couldn't possibly be a reviewer. I've heard that many times, often from trainees, but not just trainees, sometimes junior faculty, sometimes very senior faculty. And I will remind you of a couple things. First of all, you know more than you think you do. Okay, so give yourself credit. You're reading journal articles, you're publishing, or you're thinking about journal articles and you're thinking about publishing. You know more than you think you do. I also find that beginner reviewers actually do the best reviews. I find they are more thorough and they take more time because they're really motivated to do a good job. And so particularly residents, fellows, junior faculty, I think do a fantastic job because they want to impress and they want to do the best possible job they can. And I find that sometimes senior reviewers, sometimes they'll give me one or two sentences, which is not particularly helpful. And when I say give me, that means they're giving the author only one or two sentences. That's not very helpful. And so I actually find that that junior people do a great job reviewing. And you might say, well, what would I say about it? And what I recommend to people is just think if you were doing this article in Journal Club and you were discussing it. Every article has decisions that have to be made, every research study that you could question. And, I learned this. I remember doing a Journal Club as a medical student on a New England Journal paper, assuming that it would be perfect. And there were so many things that we had to discuss that we would have done perhaps differently or we questioned. And you can do the same thing with any other manuscript that's submitted. And so question it, ask them why they made decisions like that without being critical. And I think Grace is going to talk about that next, perhaps. But you don't have to be critical, be supportive and helpful, but question people. And I'm sure you will see lots of questions and lots of things you could suggest to improve, even in the best papers. So I'd like to really try to dispel that imposter syndrome because I can assure you that you'd all be great reviewers. And if you want to review for the Journal of Surgical Education, just pop your email in the chat because, as I said, we're always looking for another reviewer. I think I'll stop there. Maybe Christina, you want to open it to a question, or I'm happy to take questions at the end. Thanks again.
Thank you, Doug. Thank you for those insights. I have to say it is fantastic to sort of open the editor's brain and really understand a bit more about how they think. And the other thing I will say is that, every time, even your first paper, second paper, every time you publish in a new journal, you can learn a little bit more about that process as well. I will go ahead and pick a question from the earlier chat. How do we avoid bias if we're asked to peer review? We all have our biases, we all have our trainings. How do we avoid that? Or if we have it, how do we make that known?
So I think that's a great question. I did see that come up. And actually, I recently, I'll just give an example. I recently sent out a paper for review that was a survey. And the person I sent it to review said, I saw that survey when it came out and I read it and I actually had some problems with it. And so I didn't complete it. And so they said, should I do a review on that paper? And, it's a tough question. I think we all come in and that's a different bias. It's sort of a research frame bias, I think. There are many different biases that people have. I think we all need to acknowledge our biases as best we can, and then try to, and maybe even vocalize them to ourselves or to a colleague, and perhaps even to the editor. And then, you still have to be as objective as possible. And you have to think of the perspective, not just of you, but of people who read this journal or who would read this research. And so, it's not a simple answer. I actually said to that reviewer that I would still be fine with them reviewing. And actually, I think that it's great that they acknowledge their bias. And I think they have a perspective on that paper that's really important. And I wanted to hear it as an author, as an editor. And so I think you just have to acknowledge them as best you can and keep that in mind, but then share your perspective, because that's what we want to hear as editors. We want to hear readers, reviewers' perspectives.
Absolutely. Thank you, Doug. And I think that's good practice. If you think you may have a bias that the editor would want to know about, let it be known to the editor before you agree to review, and the editor can help you decide whether it's appropriate. And I too had a similar experience where I said, I think I was a respondent to this survey. I really think I took this survey. Do you want me to still peer review? And the editor helped make a decision that was right for the journal and right for me. Dominique, I will take your one quick question and then we'll move on to our next panelist. Dominique.
Thank you, Christina. Hi, Doug. I was just wondering, sometimes you peer review for different journals that have a different impact factor, right? So do you think, because there will be a difference between 50 and 1, your requirements or how strict you are with your requirements when you're peer reviewing, should they be adapted if it's 50 impact factor versus what, like, should I be more relaxed with what I expect from an article that is published in a one impact factor journal?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. And I think that the part I put about good science, I think is relevant to any journal.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think as you become a reviewer, particularly if you read those journals, you know that a paper is of a certain quality that really fits for that journal or not. And I've given that feedback to surgery journals before, where I say, you are an upper echelon, top of the heap surgery journal, and this is a good paper, but this is not the quality of what you typically publish. I think that's fair information in that comments to editor portion that most sites have. And you should think differently. I still think that the expectations around sound methodology and scientific method apply to any journal, but whether it's the sophistication or the quality of data or the data set or whatever it might be, I think that you should tailor that to the journal itself. The journal editor wants to hear that.
Okay.
They really.
Thank you.
Thank you, Doug. That is a fantastic answer to a fantastic question. For the sake of time, we're going to move on now to our second editor, Lauren, from Perspectives on Medical Education. Lauren, handing it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Christina. So my job today is to talk a little bit about some of the things you can avoid when acting as a peer reviewer. And I'm going to speak both from my perspective as an editor, but also as an author. So to that end, all of the bullets on the slides, I went back and I extracted these from reviews that I've gotten over the years. So these are real reviews that I've had to wrestle with. And so my first tip is to avoid being vague. I've spent many, many hours trying to understand just what a reviewer is asking me to do. And case in point is the third bullet, I just don't get figure 1. So I got this comment with no further context, and I kept thinking, well, I get figure 1. It makes total sense. I don't know how to fix it because you haven't given me the context. In this instance, we ended up writing to the editor and they helped us, but we spent a lot of time trying to figure it out. So comments that are very vague are they're not helpful to authors. Additionally, I will see people want to address whole sections, kind of as whole cloth. And in this one, they said, we'd like more details in the method section. And I didn't know if they wanted more details on my sample in our reflexivity section. Maybe they wanted to know about the questions we asked. And I think what I ended up doing here was just throwing in as much extra stuff as I could think of to try to meet the mail with this reviewer. So it's actually very hard to work on comments that are very vague from an author perspective. From an editor perspective, it can also be hard. So that bottom comment, this is a very strong manuscript. Well, as an author, I'm thrilled. That's fantastic. But that doesn't really help the author to improve the manuscript further. The other piece in this that's challenging for an editor is that the reviewer has said, my recommendation is accept. And when I'm working as an editor, I generally have 2 or 3 other peer reviews plus my own summary, and I'm trying to make a recommendation. If you drop that accept or reject or major revision into the comments to the author, that can be discordant with the final decision and with the other reviews. So that can be confusing to the authors, and it's tough for the editor to write their way around that. So I would try to avoid that if you can. The other avoid asking for the study you would have done. Now, we oftentimes ask for reviewers who are passionate about a topic, they've been thinking about it for a long time, and they have a certain way of thinking about it. However, the authors have done their own study. It doesn't help if you go back and ask for them to redo it. So in bullet 1, I recently did a study with one of my students. We interviewed a cohort of gynecologists the study was about contraception and shared decision-making. We thought a lot about the sample that we wanted to interview. However, the reviewer came back and said, we think you should go out and interview other specialties. And we pushed back on that because that was actually outside the design of the study. We were never going to go back and do interviews of other people. And to be honest, they rejected this paper because they felt we weren't going to be generalizable enough. So it happens for sure. The other thing is many of us have our own theories that we love. So we have pet theories and we tend to see the world through that lens. So oftentimes I will see reviewers recommend that someone go back and reconsider their study using a different theory. Now, chances are if someone has utilized a theory in a thorough manner, that theory influenced their entire study from soup to nuts. To ask them to go back and put a new theory onto it, you really shouldn't be able to do that without having to rerun an entire study. And if I see an author that does that, it's kind of a disingenuous way to use theory. So be careful. I know we have our theories that we love, and we love to see them in literature, but chances are the authors selected their particular theory for a very good reason and put a lot of thought into that. Okay, avoid being a copy editor. We think of your time as reviewers as incredibly valuable. As Doug mentioned, we are dying for reviewers. So we try to make sure we're using your time in the best way possible. So if you're acting as a copy editor, that's not a great use of your time. Also, keep in mind, you're going to make recommendations for changes. I'm going to make recommendations for changes. By the time we get further along with the manuscript, chances are your copy editing kind of gets wiped away. So leave that to the editor-in-chief or leave that to the copy editor. A lot of journals actually have copy editors that are going to go through and clean up the manuscripts. And then last but not least, Doug touched on this too, avoid being overly harsh. If you know authors, everybody has their own story of a barb that they received in peer review. So for me, that's the first quote. And I didn't even have to go back and look this up in my old peer reviews. I just remembered it. This was for my PhD. I think it was my second paper. And I remember just feeling gutted when I got this comment that my work was completely derivative. It made me feel bad, but there was nothing I could really do with that. I wasn't going to redo the study. So it just felt like a bit of an attack. Now, the second one to avoid is ad hominem attack. So in this second one, I was working with a colleague. It was a survey study. I do think of him as a survey expert. Now, this reviewer had a problem with something in the way we did the survey, which is fine. They told us what was wrong, but then they added this attack onto this survey expert in particular. And that just felt really inappropriate, especially as we're often writing about our colleagues. So, and then the last one, just think about your word choice. So I pulled this last bullet because of the word clumsy. If I were sitting down with someone, I probably wouldn't say their use of language is clumsy. So I tend to think about all of the words that I'm choosing. And sometimes there's words you just feel like you need to diffuse. And I kind of wish this reviewer had maybe thought about a different word. Okay, and this isn't an avoid, but this is some of the framing that I think about when I think about peer review. So I think of it as a conversation. And this partially comes from Chris Watling's recent article, Don't Be the Reviewer Too, that we published. So when you think about peer review, think about it as a conversation, both with the author and with the editor. So I often think when I'm writing up my editorial comments that I'm sitting there, I'm at a conference, we can finally be there in person, and I'm just having that conversation with them. And so what words would I use? What kind of feedback would I give them? How would I help them to move their manuscript forward? Yeah. And then the next part is you're in conversation with the editor. So again, I tend to print out my peer reviews. I'm reading them. I'm trying to understand the decision that we want to make. And some of the things that can facilitate that conversation are using the confidential comments to editor box. You can feel free to use that. You can put anything you want in there. Quite often, people will declare whether or not they have some expertise or weakness in a method or subject matter area. Oftentimes, we send manuscripts to people that we know are subject matter experts in an area, but they may not have the methodological expertise. It's totally fine to note that. I will often do that. I will get knowledge syntheses to review, but I'm not so familiar with the topic. And I will just declare that and say, I did a methods review of this paper. I'm less certain about the methods, or I'm less certain about the topic. I can't tell the context of where this is going to fit in the broader field. Have a subject matter expert look at that. And that's really valuable to us because sometimes we don't know why you have formatted your review in a specific way. And then lastly, if you're open to re-reviewing a revision. At my journal, we tend not to send revisions back to the peer reviewers, but in some cases, people really want to have another pass at it after the revision. So if you let us know, we're happy to send it back to you. But if you don't let us know, by default, we most likely won't send it back to you and you won't see it until it's further down the line. So I will wrap up there. I'm very happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Lauren. I think these tips are fantastic, and I would just thank you so much for finding some real examples of what real people have written, so that we have a sense of what that's really like to be an editor and to be looking at those and thinking about how you can make them meaningful for the persons who are authoring the papers. I would like to go ahead and do one quicker burning question. Does anyone on the session want to unmute and ask one burning question from what Lauren mentioned? Otherwise, I'll pick a question from the chat. Anyone want to unmute and ask now?
I'll ask a quick question. I think both of you have mentioned it, but maybe just to formally kind of speak to it. How do you think differently, or how would you advise people as to the response to the authors versus the response to the editor? Because there's often two distinct boxes in each peer review.
Yeah, that's a great question. So one thing I have seen, which is an avoid writing one thing in the review, the comments to editor box, and another thing in the author box. So sometimes I will see there'll be almost glowing praise for the article that the authors will see, and then they'll slam the paper in the editorial box. That's really hard, because now as an editor, I have to kind of square maybe why I'm rejecting a paper. I actually recently did a study on this where we looked at all the confidential comments for to the editor, and what we found, they were pretty close. Like, people were pretty good about making sure they're the same. But we did find it's really helpful if you want to talk about things maybe related to responsible conduct of research. It's helpful if you want to point out if you have any potential conflicts of interest. I really think of it as kind of back channeling with the author, with the editor. And sometimes I've had people post things into the editorial box because they're not sure what should actually go to the author. So again, that concept of a dialogue. And then I'll work with them to figure out what it is they want to put in that author box. So it can be a mix. Definitely see responsible conduct stuff. You know, people are afraid of salami slicing or perhaps plagiarism. That tends to go in that box for sure.
All right. Thank you, Lauren, for fielding that question. And Martin Vagelis, I see your questions in the chat box. We will have time for Q&A towards the end after we hear from our third editor, Grace. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Grace for her to share her wisdom with us. Grace.
Thanks so much. And, you know, the benefit of following people like Lauren and Doug is that I don't have that much to say. And the other thing I would add is, you know, they're speaking as auditors of tremendous generosity. And so I'd say I'm going to talk about peer review from a purely self-serving approach. And that's sort of the concept as thinking about peer review as a form of professional development. So, you know, I'll share just very briefly that my own journey in editorial work was that I was a reviewer before I was an author, and I was an associate editor before I was really a researcher. And for me, reviewing was kind of like having a front row seat about educational research and about educational scholarship without having to get my hands dirty. And I'd say my family would be the first people to say that I was particularly inclined for peer review because it is always much easier to critique other people's work than your own. But on the positive side, you learn in the process. So, you know, if you think about what are the ingredients for professional development, you want something to learn on, you want an opportunity to practice skills, and you want individualized feedback. I really think peer review provides all of that. So one way to think about it is it's kind of like asynchronous free mentorship on your work. So you have the privilege, as has been mentioned, of looking at raw, unpublished scholarship, which is now your learning substrate. You know, when you get those decision letters back, hearing from CC'd on what is sent to the author, you get to triangulate what you thought with other people's. And it's really exciting to look at something and say, oh my goodness, I had the same exact thoughts. It's wonderful to know that I was kind of on par there. So maybe you can go to the next slide, Christina, that'd be great. Thanks. So, you know, so what skills are we talking about? And here I might say, think about peer review and how it leads to your own self-study as a very similar analogy to how you answer clinical questions that you might have, right? So when you have a question and a point of curiosity in working with patients, you read about it, and that's how you learn more because it's situated in what you are especially curious about. For me, it's definitely my way of having learned about research methods that I never encountered. I still remember the paper about which I read about generalizability theory and factor analysis, methods I still have never decided to do, but it prompted me to look those things up. The skill of literature appraisal is, of course, really at the heart of evidence-based medicine. And when you look at it and decide, are those methods rigorous enough? Has the author really called out all the limitations of it? That really works that part of your brain and critical thinking as well. Scholarly expression, now you get to see both exemplars and terrible examples of what an introduction looks like. And in that way, it sort of tells you, oh, I'm going to definitely avoid that pitfall next time. And then lastly, I think we can spot cohesive, linear, well-organized writing from a mile away, even when it's hard to do ourselves. And so that practice of wearing the hat of a reader versus a writer really helps inform your writing, as has already been mentioned by my colleagues as well. And, at a point on writing, I really learned to write because I was writing peer reviews. And some people have said, like, why bother peer reviewing? Why spend hours on somebody else's manuscript when you could be working on your own? And I'd say it's been very complementary to what I do as an author. And it's low stakes in some ways. It's low stakes for you in that you're writing something for somebody else and less about worrying about your own writing. So the next slide, I'll just end with the point that, as has been stated, it gives you this rarefied window into what is late breaking in your field. You're getting an insight on editorial thresholds, right? So, I have reviewed for the New England Journal. I have never tried to publish anything in the New England Journal, but it does give me a sense of what it's like to submit something at that level. And then I'd say expertise. So I called out Nora Osman because I know she's a great reviewer because I attach great reviews to great peer reviewers' names. So those are opportunities to become an associate editor or to be on the editorial board because an editor knows how good you are at a review. So that's a way to grow your reputation in a particular area. I can name like 5 or 10 people, and I know this is true for Lauren and Doug as well, who are great reviewers and the kind of people that you want to be associate editors for your journals. This is all predicated on a foundation of skills that come from peer review in ways that you can't get anywhere else. Oh, and the last thing is I wrote something, it's a little on the snarky side. I wrote this a bunch of years ago about peer review, and it does talk about like my love of peer review.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Grace, for sharing those insights. And I agree with you. I think that we can all grow through seeing how other people do work. And in some cases, you're asked to review a manuscript, and in the back of your mind, you're thinking, my scholarship is as good as this. I can do this. I can write this paper, my own, and get it published in this journal. So there's a little bit of that as well as seeing what that bar is. So that when you are producing your own scholarship, getting a sense of what bar do I have to meet to potentially publish my paper in this journal. All right, Grace, I am going to throw you this question. And there were a couple of questions in the chat about this, but I think you're the perfect one to respond to this. How can we think about mentored peer review, group peer review, or peer review that involves trainees?
Absolutely. Do you mean from an editor's standpoint or as a reviewer?
I guess I'm saying, some people on this call may be more junior. Maybe they feel more confident if they were to peer review with a senior person. Maybe some of us are a person who does peer review with mentees. Do journals want that? How can people collaboratively submit a peer review? Are editors okay with that sort of thing?
Great. I can't speak for every single journal under the sun, but many, many journals welcome that because you're talking about creating a pipeline of future reviewers. So I think it's one of the most mutually beneficial forms of mentoring. One is, a senior faculty get lots and lots of peer review requests to the point that they may be just unable to devote that kind of time. But this is how you find a promising early career individual and get their name into the reviewer pool. So most of the time now, I don't peer review without a mentee, and that's because I'm interested in getting them into the pool. So that helps me because I may not be spending quite as long. And that individual, that mentee really learns because they get to see my perspective and their perspective. And together, I think there are early data to show that group peer review is more holistic, it's more beneficial. The exercise itself, it's meaningful for all parties too. So that's how I've managed this sort of as a reviewer, looking for mentees. And then similarly, if you are looking to be mentored, asking around saying, oh my goodness, I would love to review eventually for this journal. If you happen to get reviews, could I help you with it? And again, just mutual learning.
Absolutely. And I have engaged in many mentored peer reviews with trainees. And I often reach out and say, hey, have you peer reviewed before? I have the opportunity to review for this journal. Do you want to do it with me? And creating a shared Dropbox folder, giving them access to the article, making very clear the standards of ethicality that, we can only discuss this paper with each other. We build the review together. We submit it to the journal together. But I can't tell you how much it warms my heart when a trainee writes back to me and says, thank you for letting me peer review with you. Do you have any more we can do together? There's nothing better than that, right? Because I even get to learn from how they think, aligning with what Doug said earlier. Trainees and junior faculty can be some of the best peer reviewers that we have to call on. So thank you, Grace, for that. Doug, I see your hand raised. Comment from Doug.
Yeah, I just wanted to say what I sort of think for senior faculty, what is best practices. And as a journal editor, I want to know who's doing the review. So if I send it to a senior faculty and they want to have a resident or junior faculty do the review with them, I would like to know that. And actually what I think is best is if I ultimately invite the junior person. So what I prefer to see personally is I want to hear back from the senior person to say, you know what, I would like to mentor this person with this email address for this review. Would you be okay with that? And that is just what I want to hear. And actually, I think it's then better so that I don't want junior people doing work and senior people getting the credit. So actually what I think should then happen is I invite the junior person, knowing that the senior person is going to give them some oversight. And they could even put that in the comment, but I really think it's imperative that the junior person get the credit. And I have occasionally suspected that maybe a senior person was having other people do the review and then sending it in on their behalf without that person getting the credit. And I think Emil just said, listing that you're a reviewer on your CV is actually very beneficial. It's beneficial at the trainee level and the junior faculty level to show that you're starting to be recognized and have some expertise. So I just think it's really important if you have the chance that to me is best practices.
Absolutely. Thank you, Doug. And when I do engage in mentored peer review, and thank you, Dominique, for popping in. I have a MedEd Pearls blog post on the power of mentored peer review because it is something I'm passionate about. I inquire with the journal, make sure it's acceptable. And then when in those confidential comments to the editor, I do put, this was a mentored peer review. Mentor was Christina, mentee was person, email address, we contributed equally. And it is my hope that the editor sees that and then says, I'm going to put this person in my reviewer database because I can see that they can do a good job and should be reviewing for my journal. That's my hope. Thank you, Grace. Thank you, Doug, for those responses. What we're going to do now is we're going to move into the Q&A portion of our session. And this is the last 10 minutes, an opportunity to get any final questions answered with these panel of three fantastic editors. So I would like to give anyone the opportunity to unmute and speak freely now, or else I can choose some questions from the chat. Anyone want to unmute and start this conversation with the three editors?
I'll jump in with just a kind of comment or seek your comments. For my first, 2 decades of peer reviewing, it was, and still for many of them moving forward, it was a confidential process that I think both the author and the reviewer knew, which is I would be asked, and then when the review came forth, it didn't have my name on it. But interestingly, in the last few years, I've been approached on a few journals asking if I want to be identified. And at first I was like, geez, that's just not the norm, but I have no problem with it. I just would be curious if that's a movement in the publishing field and anyone's thoughts on that.
I can speak to that. You are correct. We're seeing more open peer review. So you are signing or signed peer review, you're putting your name on it. A lot of journals have moved that way. I believe BMJ is doing that now. I've done both open and closed. It is interesting. Like, I definitely reflect and think very thoughtfully about what I'm going to say, knowing it's going to be posted to a website. So I should say there's open peer review where your reviews are posted to the website. People can see your reviews, and then there's signed peer reviews. So just the author sees it. And I think we're seeing a movement towards increased openness across the journals, and peer review is one way. I would also say the journals that do have open peer review can be really helpful if you want to see the life cycle of a paper. So you can see what came in as the original manuscript, then you see the reviews, then you see the revised paper, and that can be really eye-opening. PLOS, the Public Library of Science, does that so you can see the life cycle of the paper. And I use that in my courses all the time with learners.
That's a really great point. Thank you, Lauren, for tackling that question. I will take a question that I saw in the chat, and I'm going to rephrase it a bit. And I think it aligns a little bit with this idea that, a lot of the journals that, relate to medical and health professions education have a lot of physician or clinician educators on the editorial board or as authors. And for, some persons, I'm not a clinician. I'm an educator and I'm a researcher. And so when you are somebody that maybe doesn't fit what you think might be that traditional mold of the type of reviewer they're looking for, should you be confident peer reviewing, and how can you give your best self to those reviews?
Sure. It's so funny because I'm reflecting that some of the most amazing educators I know are not physicians, and I think they bring very complementary reviews. I know for MedEd Portal, we usually strive to have like a PhD educator review for pedagogy and then a content expert, so that, again, it brings a balance. It's just so interesting what they will bring because of training. Many PhD educators are really very passionate about the conceptual framework that undergirds the research. And that's something that I think we as physicians who are very practical and get down to it often forget how important it is for theory to be the foundation for educational work. So it's not like one or the other. I think about the equal roles that they have.
Fantastic. Any other editors have a thought on that before we move forward?
I would just echo what Grace said. I don't have enough PhD educators on my panel of reviewers. And I have a few who are on my editorial board. They provide a perspective that I think is really, really fantastic. And sometimes, as Grace said, lacking amongst the clinician educators. And so, I don't have the opportunity to have them on every paper, but when I think there's either something about the methodology or the framework that I think would benefit from them, I draw on them. I wish I had more. I just wish I had more of them.
As a PhD educator, that makes me really happy, Doug. So thank you for saying that. I would take the question that involves timed publication, time of review, anything that we can do as reviewers to facilitate a fast process and help good science get published quickly. Lauren, you're unmuted. Did you want to respond to this one?
Sure. I mean, I think to Doug's point, if you can return your peer reviews in a timely fashion, that's really important. There are going to be sometimes when you might not be able to get it back in time. And I've had reviewers write to me and say, I'm going to need an extra week or 2 weeks. Do you still want me to do this? And again, having that conversation with the editor is very helpful. The other thing would be to make sure your reviews are clear. Like I said, authors will spend hours trying to figure out what it is you want if you haven't been explicit. So I think that can help speed up the revisions. I will say we're seeing slowness from the peer reviewers, you're seeing slowness from the authors, from the associate editors. I think right now, unfortunately, the journal process is just very slow.
I will also share that I review obviously for other journals, or maybe not obviously, but I do review for other journals. And I actually, I always get it done on time because of my job, and I feel like I have to get it done on time, but I sometimes take longer than I should. And then I realize it actually doesn't take as long as I think, and I should just get it done. And, I'm obviously, maybe the surgeon mindset might be a little different and my reviewers are a little different, but I want you to read the paper and I want you to tell me what stands out. First of all, just do you think this is good? Should we be publishing something like this, whether with some revisions? And then what stands out to you? People aren't going to read the paper 10 times most of the time. I'm not asking a reviewer to do that, and I'm not asking a reader to do that. Read it through maybe a second time and just give me some big picture things that stand out. That's what I'm looking for. And I tell people ask me all the time, how long should I spend on a review? And I will tell you, I tell them an hour. And maybe people will say different. But if I could have an hour of your time to help me figure out how to make this paper better, I think that's plenty because everybody's busy. But Grace and Lauren may disagree, but that's what I asked for. And it actually doesn't take as much time as you think. So 21 days is plenty of time to get it done.
I'll add a comment that will positively embarrass Doug. The Journal of Surgical Education is always the fastest of all the medical education journals. They're very quick. The reviews are high quality and you'll hear back sooner. Just a comment about where we are in the world of COVID. It has been really hard to get clinicians as peer reviewers, for the quadrillion reasons. And I think it does shift what we see as editors when you have more of the PhD educators doing that work and, how it shapes things. The other piece that links to what was said before about what it means to be an MD versus a PhD, when you look at med-ed journals, look at who the editor-in-chief is and whether they're a PhD educator or an MD. And that actually helps understand a little bit what the journal is looking for and what they're looking for from the reviews. And it is not intended to pigeonhole, but I will tell you, I'm such on the practical, clinical side versus the theory side. And I think that shapes how MedEd Portal has come out. So, and I'd be curious for Lauren and Doug, whether that you feel like that's true for you too.
Yeah, it's interesting as you were both talking about, you want more PhD educators. I'm thinking we need more clinician educators. My board is almost mostly PhDs. And we have a PhD editor-in-chief. So I think you're right, that does color it. And even the different publication types we've set up in our journal more reflect on the PhD side. But I totally agree. Both PhDs and MDs, I think, are incredibly welcome and valuable in providing multiple perspectives.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Lauren. Anyone, we are getting close to time. Anyone have a question that they want to shout out to our editors? Unmute yourself now. Otherwise, I'll do another question from the chat. Thank you, Sarah. Hi, Martin. Thank you for joining us. Martin, do you have a question or do you have a comment?
Oh, so first I want to walk back my lousy joke about ethical focus, and so that it was supposed to be funny and it wasn't. So sorry, Christina. You're just got me into editor mode about words and data is and data are, which trips me up every single time. So anyway, sorry about that. My question was Publons. That thing that you can register your reviews at. I have a take on this, but I just wondered what your in the editor's positions, what your take is on Publons and registering your review and collecting a record of the reviews you've done.
I mean, from my perspective, it's really more personal for the author. I don't think I've really given it much thought. We do give it as an option for our editors that want to collect their reviews and have a record that they have done these reviews. But I think from the editor perspective, honestly, I haven't thought that much about it other than we enable our authors to do it, to use that service.
Yeah, I don't know that I have any profound thoughts. I mean, I think if you take it to its fullest extent, then it would be a metric that demonstrates one's engagement in the academic world. And maybe that would be something that would be helpful for things like promotion and so forth. And to echo a comment that came earlier, it is important to be involved in peer reviewing and being an associate editor and editorial boards. Those are things that are absolutely valued in the promotion process.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Grace. Time is up. I know we have all enjoyed learning about peer review. If we can just go ahead and give a bit of a round of applause for our speakers today. Thank you so much for all of you for sharing your insights, your wealth of knowledge with us today. We are thankful for you. We're thankful for all the work that you do. And to be honest, I'm thankful to have peer reviewed for, I think, nearly all of these journals. So thank you so much for that. Everyone have a wonderful rest of your day. And thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.